the complex here. So that's one of the reasons why they weren't able to respond on their own on January 6th, was because this is not their jurisdiction. Even though it's within the metro area of DC, they can't handle it. It comes from the sergeant at arms, and it also comes from the chief of police here. So again, there may be this hearing. I don't know if it's designed to answer all the questions. It may just get us to the brink of some further questions that will have to be answered down the road.
And it's 10 o'clock now. We'll watch for this hearing to begin any moment. You can see there on your screen some of the people who are heading this up. Senator Amy Klobuchar, chair of the Rules Committee. Also Senator Roy Blunt, who's the top Republican on that committee, and Gary Peters, Democrat, of Michigan, who is the chair of the Homeland Security Committee. The top Republican on that committee is Senator Rob Portman. And you'll see here both committees gathered in sort of a rare joint hearing. There are a couple of overlapping members, but for the most part, this will be a chance for a dozen plus, about 24 senators to ask questions here of these law enforcement officers who were in charge on January 6th. Rhonda, there is the question, as you mentioned, so important of D.C. and the authority of Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Police versus what happens on Capitol Hill. We'll certainly see how much that tension comes out today.
That's right. And if there's a lack of coordination, and you'll remember on January 6th, the mayor of D.C., she had a few press briefings, and she talked about what she could do and what they could not do, and that they were waiting for responses from these other law enforcement officers on how they could respond to this issue. So again, this hearing may not answer everything, but it may also reveal that there is a very difficult lack of communication that happens when there is an emergency, and should they do away with that? Are there too many people involved in these decisions when it comes to Capitol Hill?
Let's go now to the hearing room. Thank you so much, Rhonda Colvin. We bring you this hearing live.
Ranking Member Blunt and all of our colleagues from the Rules Committee.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin questioning. I want to start out just to clear up one thing by just asking all of our witnesses a yes/no question. Based on what we know now, including the recent Department of Justice indictments, do you agree that there is now clear evidence that supports the conclusion that the January 6th insurrection was planned and it was a coordinated attack on the U.S. Capitol? Just say, everyone agree?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that this attack involved white supremacists and extremist groups?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that this was a highly dangerous situation, which was horrific, but could have actually been worse without the courage of the officers that you commanded?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so now let's look at what we knew leading up to it, or what you knew leading up to it, or what people that worked for you knew leading up to it. We knew leading up to it that on leading up to January 6th, President Trump sent nationwide tweets telling people to come to Washington on January 6th and saying, be there, will be wild. And according to public reporting by the Washington Post, the FBI's Norfolk field office issued a threat report on January 5th that detailed specific calls for violence online in connection with January 6th, including that protesters, quote, be ready to fight, end quote, and quote, go there ready for war, end quote. I guess I'll start with you, Mr. Sun. When a critical intelligence report is received by the Capitol Police from an intelligence community source like the FBI, who usually would receive it? And I guess I'll start with, did you receive this report?
Thank you very much for the question, ma'am. I actually, just in the last 24 hours, was informed by the department that they actually had received that report. It was received by what we call one of our sworn members that's assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is a task force with the FBI. They received it the evening of the 5th, reviewed it, and then forwarded it over to an official at the intelligence division over at U.S. Capitol Police Headquarters.
And so you hadn't seen it yourself?
No, ma'am. It did not go any further than that.
Okay. And then was it sent to the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms?
I don't believe it went any farther than from the over to the sergeant at the intelligence division.
Okay, and Mr. Irving, Mr. Stanger, did you get that report? Beforehand, Mr. Stanger, did you get the report?
No.
Okay, Mr. Irving.
I did not.
Okay. Okay, so I think that may have contributed part to the lack of information, but I'll leave that for the future. Now let's go back to another report. I know on January 3rd, Mr. Sun, you said in your written testimony that the Capitol Police published intelligence assessments of the event, including one on January 3rd. Do you mostly rely on your federal partners like the FBI to gather and analyze intelligence on potential threats to the Capitol and members of Congress?
Yes, I think what's important to realize as a law enforcement agency, we're a consumer of intelligence and information that's provided by the intelligence community. The intelligence community is 18 federal agencies that collect information, do the analyzing of the raw data, raw intelligence, and then provide it to us. So we're reliant on that information to be complete and accurate.
But in that report, we now know, according to your testimony, that tens of thousands of participants were likely to descend on Washington. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the January 3rd memo, according to the Washington Post, made clear that supporters of President Trump see January 6th as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election, and that, quote, this sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more of an incentive to become violent. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, ma'am.
The article also quoted the memo as stating that unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters, but rather Congress itself is a target on the 6th. Is that right?
That is correct.
And did you have any indication that many of these protesters might arrive armed or that members of extremist groups might be there?
We knew members of extremist groups would be there, and there was social media calls for people to come armed, yes.
You've also said that at a January 5th meeting with Capitol Police, the Sergeant at Arms and federal law enforcement, military officials, all present at the meeting indicated that there was no new intelligence report for January 6th. Is that right?
That is correct, ma'am.
But your testimony states that the Capitol Police took a number of steps after these assessments, like what you said was the largest number of civil disturbance unit platoons possible, increasing dignitary protection coverage, coordinating with the DC police, and ordering all hands on deck status for Capitol Police. Is that right?
That is correct, ma'am. We took extensive efforts to prepare for the events based on the information, much of which you just reviewed, yes.
Okay, good. So if the information was enough to get you to do that, why didn't we take some additional steps? Why didn't you and others involved to be better prepared to confront the violence?
We expanded our perimeter. When we expanded the perimeter, again, we knew there was going to be some maybe limited violence, but we did. We expanded the perimeter. We took a number of steps to outfit our personnel with additional hard gear. We developed a plan for if we had protesters that may be armed. And that was one of the reasons the expanded perimeter and the heightened risk that I went to the Sergeant at Arms and requested the National Guard.
But now you realize it wasn't enough, those security measures. Is that right?
Well, that is, hindsight being what it is. I mean, you look around the Capitol right now and you see the resources that are brought to bear based on the information we now know from January 6th.
Okay. Mr. Sun, you stated in your written testimony that you first made a request for the Capitol Police Board to declare an emergency and authorize National Guard support on Monday, January 4th, and that request was not granted.
That is correct, ma'am.
Your testimony makes clear that the current structure of the Capitol Police Board resulted in delays in bringing in assistance from the National Guard. Would you agree with that? That's one of the things we want to look at.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you think that changes are needed to make clear that the Capitol Police Chief has the authority to call in the National Guard?
I certainly do. I think in exigent circumstances, there needs to be a streamlined process for the Capitol Chief of Police for the Capitol Police to have authority.
Okay. And Mr. Stanger, do you think that reforms are needed to the structure of the Capitol Police Board to make that clear?
I think a review of the Capitol Police Board and their statutory authority is probably would be a good time to do this now. There's a lot of statutes out there in the Capitol Police Board that go back many, many years. Things have changed, and it's probably to make the board a little bit more nimble. It's probably not a bad time and an idea to take a look at what's there.
It's probably an understatement with what happened, but thank you. Mr. Irving, your views?
I would certainly agree with both Chief Sund and Michael Stenger. I think a review would certainly be warranted at this time of the Capitol Police Board.
Mr. Sund, your written testimony states that you had no authority to request the assistance of the National Guard without an emergency declaration of the Capitol Police Board. Okay. On what rule, regulation, or authority did you base that view?
I'd have to go back and look the specific rule, but it's a standing rule that we have. I cannot request the National Guard without a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board. It's kind of interesting because it's very similar to the fact, I can't even give my men and women cold water on an excessively hot day without a declaration of emergency. It's just a process that's in place.
And to be clear, apart from the Capitol Police Board, you also face delays in getting authorization to bring in the National Guard from the Department of Defense. Is that correct? We'll be hearing from them next week.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Would you agree that there were serious issues at the Pentagon that contributed to the fact that Guard troops did not arrive at the Capitol until about 5:40 that day after most of the violence had subsided?
I don't know what issues there were at the Pentagon, but I was certainly surprised at the delays I was hearing and I was seeing.
Okay, very good. And my last question, just as of all of you, in addition to the reforms of the police board, which are very clear need to be made, any other suggestions that wouldn't involve classified information you have for us, Mr. Sund?
As reference to some of the recommendations, I would look at, again, one of the big things that I think was a contributing factor to this was intelligence. I think as you meet with the intelligence community and law enforcement in the intelligence community, we have a very good relationship. I think the aperture just needs to be opened up a little bit farther. Like Chief Conte had mentioned, January 6th was a new day. It was a change of what threat we face. And I think getting them to open the aperture and looking a little bit harder. And I think internally looking at some of our policies, procedures, our processes for how we handle special events, how we handle incident command was stuff we can do. And then looking at physical security of the building and the grounds, I think is going to be critical. I know a lot of people have talked about, the fencing, the open environment. I understand, and I know that goes way back, and members of Congress like the open environment. I think there are ways to develop a more secure campus while keeping an open environment, but I'll leave that for more classified or restricted hearings.
Okay, thank you. Anything you would add in addition, just any other thing you'd add in addition to what the former police chief laid out here, Mr. Stenger?
I would be very supportive of those areas that the chief mentioned. I think he's right on the money there. I think there's maybe another area of use of force that probably needs to be coordinated better in the region here. But certainly intelligence needs to be taken a look at as to how it works. We have a lot of people that we've ramped up since 9/11. And I think maybe it's time to take a look at how efficient it is on the gathering of intelligence and the collection of intelligence.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to allow my colleagues to ask that same question of you, Mr. Irving, and you, Chief Conte, because I've gone over my time. Thank you.
Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye.
Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye.
Related to the events of January 6th. Thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Next, a new member of both committees, Senator Padilla. hearing, I wanted to say a few words at the end. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Peters and Senators, the ranking members Blunt and Portman for conducting this hearing in such a professional way. We had a bipartisan agreement on how this hearing would be conducted, who our witnesses would be, and also the plan to have additional hearings, including one next week that we'll be announcing tomorrow with the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI, because clearly we have and our members have additional questions. I want to thank the witnesses, as I said, for voluntarily appearing before us. I want to thank Captain Mendoza for her moving words and bravery. In many ways, she represents all of the officers that were there that day. A few things that are very clear to me. The first is the statements at the beginning from all the witnesses. They may have disagreed on some details and, okay, but there is clear agreement that this was a planned insurrection. So, and I think most members here very firmly agree with that. And I think it's important for the public to know that. This was planned. We now know this was a planned insurrection. It involved white supremacists. It involved extremist groups. And it certainly could have been so much worse except for the bravery of the officers. Secondly, we learned about the intelligence breakdown. So many of the members of both committees asked about that, particularly the January 5th, the FBI report that had some very significant warnings from social media about people who were coming to Washington who wanted to wage war. The fact that did not get to key leaders in the Sergeant of Arms or the Capitol Police Chief is, of course, very disturbing, really on both ends. I mean, you can't just push send. As we all know, we get tons of emails and hope that it gets to the right person, especially when we're dealing with something so serious. The January 3rd intelligence report that came right out of the Capitol Police also contained, according to Washington Post reports and other information, some pretty foreboding details that I would have thought would have resulted in planning and more preparations. The delays in the approving a request for National Guard assistance, both from the Capitol Police Board and the Department of Defense. The fact that the Sergeant at Arms were focused on keeping the members safe in both chambers while the chief was trying to get some emergency approval. To me, you can point fingers, but you could also look at this as a process that is not prepared for a crisis. And I think out of that, there's some general agreement, just based on talking to a number of members, that there should be changes to the Capitol Police Board, the approval process, and the like. And it's clear that that action must be taken not only to protect our Capitol, but also to protect the brave officers charged with protecting the citadel of democracy. Better intelligence sharing, always an outcome when there's failures of intelligence. We know that, but I think we'll get more details in the coming week. Some security changes at the Capitol, requests that have been made for a while on those changes that I think we have to seriously consider. And no, it does not have to be barbed wire. And of course, this is a public building, and you want the school groups, and you want the veterans, and you want people to be able to visit here. But that doesn't mean that we don't make some smart security changes to this building. The use of the National Guard. We know after 9/11, the National Guard helped for quite a while. We also know that we have to have a plan going forward, as well as consider what happens when we need a greater number of National Guard in a crisis and how those approvals are made. Those are just some of my takeaways. I'm sure many others will have more, but I do want to make it clear that there are some items of agreement between most of us on this committee, and I don't think we should let the words of a few become the story here, because I think this has been a very constructive hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for coming forward as they did. And I want to thank Senator Peters, and we look forward to more hearings. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair Klobuchar. I have enjoyed this hearing. Thank you for your leadership. It's been good working with you and your entire team with rules.
Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Warner. Aye. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Murky. Aye.
Hey, Johnny, make it 6:30.
Almost.
Mr. Kennedy, aye.
Looky here. This first. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 92, the nays are 7, and the nominee is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the president will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. Under the previous order, the question occurs on the nomination of Thomas Greenfield. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Brasso.
Less than 53 minutes.
Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper,